Aditya, can you see me now?
Yeah, I
The
see you, but
lighting is well now. I think we've had a fairly dramatic beginning to this conversation.
yeah, yeah.
Perhaps a little more dramatic than we would have liked at this time.
Are you
Uh,
good with my audio and my
I,
lighting?
I'm very good with your audio and lighting. And I think we are live right now. So
Sure, I know
we,
that. Yeah, yeah.
so I mean, it looks like other people who are tuning into the live stream will also be in a position to see us right now.
Sure.
Am I
Sure.
lighting? I suppose it could be a little brighter. This is fine. So, how are you doing? How's your evening going?
Well, it's like waiting for Godot.
This,
I'm glad we're on.
I this
Hello.
we don't expect Godot to come by, right? So this is a rare exception to that
Yeah.
situation. So this I also remember you telling me that Godot is one of your favorite plays, isn't it?
Well, it is amongst my favorites. Yeah, yeah.
Mm. And any reason why? Do you want to tell me why you found Beckett and Godot and this
Well,
interesting?
it's a play that's up for multiple interpretations. It's obscure. It's got a kind of a musical rhythm to it, and
Mm.
it's a very tough play for actors. So every performance that I've seen of it
Mm.
has been dramatically different from the other. So it
Mm.
has all of those characteristics of abstract and
Mm.
remarkable theater, you know.
Mm. I mean, I think that's it's fairly accurate and fairly wonderful. But so shall we jump into where we are here and why we've sort of come together, right? And
Sure.
so just to give others who are sort of tuning in right now context into how all of this came about, I remember that you'd agreed to do a talk with a small group of students at NLS and I think a few other law schools where there were some efforts to sort of raise money for COVID-19 related relief efforts, right?
Yeah.
And I think the conversation, I remember just to recap it for the sake of our audience, the conversation that we had right after that was essentially that the legal profession is, especially the industrial, the part of it which is focused on the transaction and the dispute, has always been like fairly well monetized. The legal profession is one of those professions which are never going to go out of style, right? And for lawyers, especially people in your
Yeah.
position and us, there's a certain resilience to our profession. So economically speaking, other industries may come and go, but the relevance of what we do continues to stay, even though the form sort of evolves over a period of time. And so I remember talking to you and suggesting to you that we start having a conversation around how we can mobilize lawyers to sort of raise money towards COVID-19 related efforts. And it's actually interesting to see. But as soon as we launched it this morning, we've already collected over 20 or 30,000 rupees from the morning. It's quite a nice feeling because we didn't expect this kind of kindness really to come out of it. So do you want to tell me a little bit about what you had in mind when you thought about this exercise? What does this exercise mean to you? What do you think we're trying to do here?
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I don't think the legal profession is unscathed by what's happening now. I read yesterday of a young lawyer having committed suicide simply because he was unable to tide over the financial difficulties of this COVID lockdown. So the risks and consequences are pretty severe, even with the legal profession. Yes, of course, there are those who are sitting pretty, but young independent counsel who have no guarantee of their work, who don't have retainers, and so on and so forth, are very much dependent on day-to-day work that comes their way, and they also need help and support, and that is happening as we speak. I'm so disappointed that one of our colleagues could not be helped in these circumstances. As far as what you're doing, Badri, of course, you would be able to articulate your vision better. But from what I've discussed with you and what I've seen on your write ups, there are two or three things that you're doing which strike a chord with me. One is, of course, the fundraising itself for COVID and trying to reach out to those communities that are most affected. I think I think we've lost Badri, but anyway, I'll continue to answer that question. One is to reach out to those communities that are most affected by this pandemic. And there's no two ways about it that we all have to do as much as we can. The other aspect is the sort of the multidisciplinary approach that you are trying to bring. I've seen that you're trying to bring artists and lawyers and professionals together under a single umbrella. And that's wonderful. And that is the way it is going forward. All disciplines are now looking at an interface with one another. Yeah, you're back, Badri. That's good to know. All I was talking about our interdisciplinary approach in what this effort is about. Today, maths and music are going together. Physics and theater is going together. Microbiology and anthropology is going together. And the law is, in a way, central to it, because I remember what Dr. Menon once asked us in one of our early legal method classes. You know, he said, you can define what, say, physics is, or what chemistry is, what sociology is, but you really can't define the law. And why is that? And I was glad that I was able to put up my hand and respond to his question by saying, that's because the law is each one of those. The law is social science, the law is commerce, right? The law is art, and so on. That's probably the last thing that I got right in the law school, but it remains that this multidisciplinary approach is at the heart of humanities and all professional undertaking. And therefore that's important. And very quickly, the third thing that I noticed in your objectives is that you're trying to, if not simplify, humanize the law. And what is law if it's not justice, and what is justice if it's not, you know, humane? And therefore, those are the 2 or 3 important aspects of this exercise, and I hope that you're able to develop them as this goes along.
Right. Really, you know, I mean, I do feel like there's a collective responsibility around this, you know, because, you know, I'd like to invite your opinion on something that might sound slightly provocative, but really, I feel like it's worthwhile to sort of think about it a little more. Because lately I've been feeling like the lawyers sort of, we lawyers can be accused of having made law just our business, as opposed to making it accessible to people who are not necessarily in contact with it, even though they're constantly affected by it. Do you feel like this is a fair characterization? Do you feel like there's something we can do about this? How do we go about doing this? Because there's one aspect which is, I think, very central to this is how civics is taught in school, right? It's by far the most boring subject, because I don't feel like it's necessarily relevant to learn how many judges there are on the Supreme Court, for instance. You know, but I want to understand what justice means. You know, I want to understand what my responsibilities to another citizen would look like. I want to understand what kind of relationship I have with the state. You know, and what do you think it is about the nature of the law which doesn't allow it to realize the kind of interdisciplinarity that you're sort of alluding to?
Look, I think that is a concern with a lot of pedagogic study. It's not just civics in school, it's jurisprudence in law school. Why was jurisprudence such a dense and dry sort of subject when it's really the soul of the law? You mentioned justice. The whole notion of justice is the jurisprudence of the law, to put it simply. And the best method to, in fact, teach jurisprudence, I would believe, is realpolitik. It's case law, case study method. I noticed that Arun Thiruvengadam was on our chat just a while ago, and I'm sure Arun's doing that in his classes as well. But whatever I recall of jurisprudence, it was always meant to be slightly out of reach, slightly, if not academic, esoteric, and not accessible, and pseudo even. And that is a problem. If that's the problem with the law, we need to deal with it. I've always maintained that the beauty of the law is in simplifying its complexity. It is complex. Let's not make excuses about it. Law is complex. It is vexed. It is bound by a lot of factors, facts, evidence, law, precedent, what have you, societal pressures, and so on. But advocacy is simplifying all of that. It's communicating that to judges. It's at times communicating that to clients. And yes, I think there is an onus on everyone. It's not that the law needs to be dumbed down. The beauty of many of the professions is in its nuance. We don't get rocket science for a reason, right? But having said that, the law is something that affects everyone, unlike perhaps many other sciences. And therefore, yeah, be it at a school level, be it at a professional level, be it at a justice delivery level, be it in academia, I think there has to be an effort at all levels to make the law less dense, certainly not deliberately make it difficult to understand, to realize that being in a position to simplify it is cerebral. There's no shame in simplifying complex issues. In fact, that is cerebral, and we all, council included, need to be aware of that. And if, I mean, charity begins at home. If I'm able to try and do that in my professional sphere, I'm sure that that has an impact when it comes to communicating the law and making it more compatible with non-lawyers.
But there's a crucial difference here, which I'm not sure if you're necessarily speaking to very clearly, in the sense that, you know, everyone feels like they have an expertise over what the law is or what the law should be, right? In a way that I don't necessarily claim that I have an expertise over rocket science. It's the domain of rocket scientists to work on the law, on rocket science. But the funny thing with like law and justice is how do you convey, let's say, you know, I mean, how do you convey a sense of empathy for a fellow citizen and think of it in codified forms? Because the best sort of example that I can sort of pick up on is that is in the context of, say, criminal punishment. Our, like, say, a tribal notion of justice. I don't want to say tribal necessarily. It's a word that we shouldn't use too lightly, but it's very easy to think of punishment in terms of deterrence, right? Think about, say, the claim that capital punishment is necessarily the way to go in terms of justice delivery. Now, to be able to understand that the aspirations of the law and the aspirations that we have of each other as a society might be slightly different from it, how do we do a better job of conveying this? Because this has become a problem also, I feel, with most of our discourse on popular news, right? The minute we come to nuances,
last Friday. Yeah.
Hey, I think we should ask participants to mute themselves. It's very hard for us to like.
Yeah, I lost a little bit of it at the end, but look, I have a twofold response to it. Number one, look, the law is an expertise profession. I'm not going to deviate from that stand. Just like you don't go on Google and get medical remedies, you don't go on Google and find legal remedies. If you do it, you're making the same cardinal mistake that you do perhaps as you do as a medical patient. There is a subtlety, there is an expertise to it, which is best left to the lawyers. I'm going to say that very clearly. Now, beyond that, you're speaking of making it slightly more inclusive. Yes. And of course it can. There's no doubt about it. I think COVID, in a sense, is a great example of how multidisciplinary approaches have to take place when it comes to public well-being, right? Now, there was a period when decisions were being made only by the doctors. And then quickly people realized that this can't be decided just by doctors. With due respect, it requires public health professionals, public policy folks. You need people who are economists, you need statisticians, you need people who deal with sort of disease at a very research and academic level. You need lawyers and so on. And that's true of the law. I mean, you can, a lot of programs that are being offered, master's degrees, the masters of public policy and so on, have that interface. And when it comes to developing the jurisprudence that we began by discussing, of course, it's very welcome when you have inputs from, say, sociologists. You talk about crime, you talk about sentencing. That is where it cannot be unidimensional. Inputs from folks who've studied mental health, who've studied reform, who've got a pulse on crime, society, caste, anthropology are very welcome. And if the law is not meeting that, which I suppose it's not, it certainly needs to open those windows and let ideas flow. They need to flow at a policy level, at a legislation level, right? When it comes to law making, that's the time for the maximum interface to happen. And that process most certainly should go on if it means restructuring curriculum in the law school to make it more multidisciplinary. Absolutely. But let's not make bones about it and say that the law is only about mutual obligations and civic rights. Yes, that is at a version 1.1. But there is a far greater nuance and an obligation that comes with the practice of the law, which has to be respected.
So, so how do you think you do that in your practice? What are the contexts in which you feel like your understanding of, say, principles outside the law have informed? Can you think of an example so that I can understand what you're saying better?
Multiple examples. I mean, if you're arguing constitutional law issues, supposing you're arguing a matter related to reservation, you certainly can't argue it simply from precedent and from the black letter of the law. You've got to take into account social study. You've got to take into account economic doctrines. You've got to read widely, and so on, and that helps you develop your arguments. You do private arbitrations. I was doing an arbitration that related to a dispute on demonetization, where one had to cross-examine an economist. Now, we've done arbitrations where one had to cross-examine biologists. That's not my expertise at all. And obviously, that's going to flow through a multidisciplinary method. You have to then pretend to be a scientist or an economist for the day. And when I say pretend, I say it responsibly. You need to be able to carry whatever expertise you can develop in a short span of time as needed for that particular proceeding and try and deliver. So it's there. And I can give you multiple such examples where the law necessarily has to interact with professionals and professions outside of it.
Right. That's nice to know. I mean, I think it is inevitable, right? Because it's the nature, as you said earlier, it's the nature of the law to sort of intersect with every discipline it comes across with. Personally, when I was younger and thinking about whether I wanted to go to law school or not, I was actually contemplating being a physicist or doing pure science, And I got to this point of time in my life where suddenly I realized that the law is the only discipline where you can sort of intersect with every discipline that exists in some form or the other. Because there is an architecture of personal human interaction which is described through what we know of as codified rules or the law. And so much of it is not even codified. Like, for instance, rules of courtesy, rules of behavior, the fact that, we have to wear clothes right now, is something that seeped its way into patterns of operation and interaction. This is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, now, the code of conduct, sorry to cut you there, but the code of conduct is actually very intricate. It does govern practically every dimension of our everyday life, right from the mundane to the sort of the surreal. It's all there in black and white. Of course, there are still matters between the lines that you read and develop as you go along, but a lot of that is also codified. Yes.
Absolutely. And so, okay, so let's move on to this. I want to understand, Aditya, the way in which, yesterday we were talking about what it means to be a performer, right? Because so much of being a practicing advocate is about presenting yourself a certain way, presenting the case of your client in a certain way. And in a certain way, you have to be a responsible performer, because especially now with you as a senior advocate, you have a duty towards shaping the law. You're not just bound to your clients and representing their case, but like to be able to represent it in a way that is appropriate to what the ends of justice are. So can you tell me a little bit about how you think of your presence in court and the aspect of performing your role as an artistic practice, but in a legal kind of context? How do you think about that operating?
Look, there is a certain amount of truth to the fact that we are performers. Comparisons are made with theater performers, and sometimes ridiculed to say that it's drama. But you and I have a shared interest in the theater, and there's nothing disparaging about the art form of theater, is there? If someone has a script prepared, which is delivered with complete honesty, with talent, with ethics, with conviction, that's a great place to be, which is what councils do, because unless you're a party in person, your problem is never your own. And in that sense, you are representing an external cause. There is a script that is there to be presented. It comes with an art form, with craft, with preparation, and so on. But there is a further nuance to it, which is that that's not a script that is fed to you, right? Now, you mentioned my role as a senior. I'm in many ways responsible for my own script. You're not just the performer, you're also the playwright in that sense. You also direct. You control content, which is what actors may or may not be able to, right? So it's not just your interpretation of what your brief is, but many times your brief is prepared and orchestrated by you to begin with. So yeah, there is of course a performance element to it, but it's a lot deeper than that. There's a great deal of strategy that goes into it. That there's a great deal of autonomy in the manner in which you go about your business. It's contested, right? Those performances are not fake. When you have showdowns in court, sometimes things get ugly, they get personal. You lose friends, you make friends, but things can get out of hand many times, right? So it's not just, I mean, if that's the impression that people have, that it's a bit of showmanship and so on, I don't think that's true. I would like to believe that good counsel are more bona fide and more sincere about this performance that you talked about.
This, I mean, but you can't really help the fact that there is a characterization of lawyers as being, you know, these folks who can take any position on any matter. And sometimes, you know, like I feel like our legal education almost came in the way of us taking positions which are more ethical or moral than we would like it to be, simply because we felt like it was necessary to maintain, I don't want to call it neutrality, but a distance from what we're speaking about. Do you think that's reasonable? What do you think we can do to sort of have, I mean, hold on to a sense of what
sorry, I lost the last bit again, but I hear you. I do share the view that the emphasis on professional ethics in law school and in law schools in general, I think is low. I don't know why. It's actually crucial, especially if you're in advocacy. And to be able to filter concepts of personal morality from professional ethics is no easy task. We've spent our lives in court in real cases on a daily basis, trying to walk that line where our personal morality and our professional ethics are compatible at one level, where we're able to find those spots where we can proceed with our profession without compromising our soul. So for people who say that you take any position, you take any client that comes your way, again, I think is a sort of an extreme notion to have. It probably helps you kind of browbeat the profession in some ways. Maybe in some ways we've earned that reputation, but people also have to appreciate the very difficult ethical challenges that lawyers face. The demand on us to be able to appear for a cause and in a case by distancing our moral positions on it and still continuing to conduct those cases with professional ethics is not an easy thing to do. It's not like you just say, oh yeah, what's the brief? What's the fee? Let me go out there and do it. It doesn't work like that. There's a lot of circumspection that happens. And when your personal morality comes in the way, then I've always said this to colleagues, to my juniors, to students, that if your personal morality is coming in the way, don't do that line of work. You will not just defeat your own self, you will let down the client, you will let down the cause. I'll give you a simple example. Now, if you have a concern appearing for accused in, say, matters of sexual assault and rape, as a person, don't do those cases. There's no pressure on you. In fact, the code says that you will not turn away a brief unless there's, a conflict of interest. It's like the demand on a doctor to treat whoever walks through his or her door, right? Doctors don't make moral judgments. They should not. And that's the same expectation of us. But I can say that if you're really not able to do justice to a brief because your morality is coming in the way, don't take it. But beyond that, if there is no real moral issue, then don't get into this process of pontificating and morally judging clients for what they've done or what they've not done. That's not your job. Right. There is a square within which the facts of each case will fall. There are series of defenses or offenses, as you will, available to every case. You present them, your opponent presents his or her version, and a judge makes a decision. And there you're on the right side of morality and ethics. But let me say this, what I'm saying is born of a great deal of turmoil that lawyers go through, especially if you have a conscience. And you're consistently trying to do it. You do that every time, and you make sure that you've crossed that barrier, as it were, where you have no moral qualms about it. I'm not just talking about conflicts of interest. I'm talking about more visceral things, personal concerns. And once you do that, then you move on from there.
Do you think you could recall an example early in your career where you were thinking about, where you faced a conflict which you felt was a turning point in your practice as a lawyer and your evolution as a practitioner of the law?
You know, it's not one case, Badri. There are multiple cases that offer you multiple challenges. Now, for instance, my dad had a concern with his landlord. Right? My dad's a businessman. His landlord wanted to evict him. The matter was in court. My dad wanted me to take that case. I said no, because that's a particular conflict. My dining table conversations with my dad cannot revolve around the case. That not just fractures our relationship, it puts an incredible pressure on me because it's not professional anymore. I'm obviously subliminally thinking of my dad and so on. There are cases where clients come to you with ridiculous requests. There are cases where clients ask you to do things that, I mean, I can't mention them publicly, but the sort of thing that can make your skin crawl. And as a young lawyer, I mean, it's very easy to say, oh, you know, just show them the door. But if you have no briefs, you have no work, you're young at the bar, and you're losing a client because there is a conflict there, it does pinch you. It's not to say that we do it. You don't do it. But you take a couple of seconds on it and then you say, no, I'm sorry, I don't do this sort of thing. And with a little bit of time, you asked me as a young lawyer, with a little bit of time and experience, you realize that your response has to be far more spontaneous. So today, or even 10 years ago, if something like that happened, without batting an eyelid, I would be able to say, you know, I'm not that person, go find someone else. There are instances where you will have a conflict of interest. You may have a conflict of interest, not just professionally, it may be personal. I said family, it could be friends, and so on. So, I mean, there are multiple such situations that arise, which give rise to these challenges to you. There are issues on fee, for example, right? We don't have a contingency model in India, right? So there are clients who would want to pay you depending on the outcome, offer you percentages if you succeed. That's the sort of thing you have to say no to, right? The court demands it of you.
Right. Yeah.
And you have those challenges. You have other challenges. I had a personal policy that I don't brief senior counsel, for example, when I was a junior. And that cost me a great deal of work.
Right.
I lost a lot of big ticket corporate clients because they came with strings attached. They said, we'll have you as our counsel, but we want you to brief a senior. And I said, no, I don't do that. So that's a separate challenge of its own, ethical or otherwise, you call it what you will. But those are personal issues that one deals with from time to time.
Right. Okay. So why don't we move to another phase in our conversation? So I'm going to use one of the questions which I promised you that I would ask. I hope you've had some time to mull over this, which is, so how would you describe yourself without talking about what you do or where you're from?
To be honest, I didn't think of any of your questions because that takes away from the real moment, as it were.
Right.
How would I describe myself without describing what I do or where I'm from? Did you say?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm work in progress. I find it hard to speak about myself, but this COVID lockdown has been a period of reflection, and you do reflect. And what is the litmus ultimately? I've always maintained that hopefully, you know, you have a degree of satisfaction with what you've done. I don't mean that in an achievement sense. I just mean it more in a fulfillment sense. Have you done enough things that have fed your soul? So in that sense, I'm somebody in pursuit of those dimensions, not just of my profession, but of my entire life, as it were, to be able to find that synergy with, you know, you talked about interdisciplinary stuff. So try and find that synergy with not just relationships, but with life choices. And therefore, yeah, I'm very much in that sense on the prowl.
ask you another follow-up question on that, because that's an answer which demands further questioning, right? So you said you want to do things which feed your soul, and I think we all must do more and more of the things that feed our soul. So what have you discovered has fed your soul in the days that have passed? What insights have you reflected on in the last 45, 50 days in this context? Do you want to share something with us? And you can be as broad as you want, Aditya. You can talk about your, I mean, I know you have so many interests, and we're just going to get into that right after this. But what are the kinds of things that feed your soul? And then we can move into that.
Well, honestly, a lot of things that feed my soul, I can't do now. Travel is number one on that list. And traveling alone, as I do most of the time, is a tremendous experience. And that I miss. I crave that very much. But that you can't do. You know that we have an interest in theater. We've done one sort of online reading, but I do miss that feel of live readings and so on that we were doing every month. But within the constraints of this lockdown, I think I have reverted to doing a bit of non-legal writing, which feels nice. I wrote my first play, which was a good experience. I wrote a bit of poetry, very, very unpublishable poetry, but I still wrote it and it made my heart happy. I did a bit of writing on my old PhD thesis, which was finished 12 years ago, and I went back and did a full edit on it, which has nothing to do with the law. And I think those are some of the things I think that give you that sense of fulfillment. They do even otherwise. But here, when you're in this isolated state, I haven't been to court now for almost 2 months. What we do on a daily basis is really who we are. And that's not on the cards now for a while. So short of that, I think these are some of the things that have, kept me sane.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you one more question, a few more questions on the themes, right? So this, I really like the little bit of hesitation you sort of exhibited when you said unpublishable poetry. This, because the pressure to sort of be right and perfect and have everything figured out is just so intense in our lives right now that I feel like not enough time is spent on learning something new, failing at it, getting better at it over a period of time. So it's I mean, like, for a senior advocate such as yourself to say that I'm doing something that I'm not great at, I really admire that. I just wanted to point that out. And this, speaking of your love for solo travel, what is it about solo travel that gets you? Because it's not an easy experience, and it doesn't start off by being a very safe kind of experience, right? So how did you get into solo travel? I do know that from a distance, Aditya, you're a lone wolf kind of figure. I mean, you're your own man. You like doing what you do. You like having a viewpoint that you stick with and you stand for. And your reputation and the sort of culture that you've built around yourself is respectful of a personal moral compass, personal ethical compass. And that's something you've been speaking about over and over in our conversation. So I want to understand how, what is this notion of yourself that you have within society? Is it it seems like it's both connected and disconnected. You seem pretty introverted, but distant from the everyday occurrences of society. And at the same time, have a deep sense of commitment and obligation towards how you should be participating in society, which is actually interesting. It's not fully introverted, nor is it fully extroverted. And what does that have to do with this love for solo travel? I'd like to change that if that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. You've been kind at most parts. These are not easy questions to answer. Yes, of course, I do think I am at one level perhaps a bit of a loner, as you said. But having said that, I am professionally and personally very deeply invested in things around me to the extent that I can be. Look, this is not really about me, but since you asked that question, I think we're all at one level two people, right? We have our private and personal spaces, and then we have our interface with our families and our extended communities and the socio-politics of our country and the world around us. And that is a constant process of to and fro, right? We flow both ways. Some of us perhaps absorb more than others. Some of us give out more than others. That to me is besides the point. At the end of the day, I think there's nobody who's either immune to it or is completely an extrovert, as you will. Even perhaps the most extroverted person, I'm pretty sure at some level has a strong private side that nobody knows about. Many times, in fact, being extroverted is a shield. I would believe, without being critical, but I think that's happened. I know people who are like that. But as for travel, well, I mean, it's very liberating. You're right. Initially, when I traveled by myself, it was a bit frightening. Actually, it took a while to get accustomed to it. But beyond the point, it's nice to lose yourself in new territories. It takes you out of your comfort zone. I see my friend Lokesh is on the chat. Two of us travel together whenever we can, especially when it comes to wildlife travel and so on. But I think going overseas in particular by yourself is very liberating because it's new culture, it's new terrain. I do a bit of rugby travel where I follow international games abroad. And it's a special feeling to be one amongst 80,000 fans. Nobody knows you. You don't know anybody. It's nice. It's a trip. You make new friends. You have no baggage in this. I mean, when you have a backpack, you really have no baggage, but you also have no sort of emotional baggage, as it were. You're able to do your own thing, read, be on trains. And I'm sure a lot of people have done that, but I can assure you that is wonderful for your mind. It refreshes you. You come back de-stressed. You come back with a sort of a clean slate. And that's the reason I tend to go back to that from time to time.
This, I like more and more, we're discovering more and more arcane interests, and it's very interesting, but I'm not going to go further down that path for now. I want to, on the other hand, ask you about your PhD. You had no business doing a PhD. There was no need for you to spend time troubling yourself as much as, doing a PhD must be, right? Like, I mean, I shudder the idea of doing a PhD independently, and you were thinking about doing it at a time in your life where I don't want to say that things were necessarily the most stable or you're necessarily the most well set in the context of your practice, right? And why did you think of doing it? And if I'm not mistaken, it was on defense policy, wasn't it? And
it was on civil-military relations in India and Pakistan.
Yeah. This is so. Now we need to ask you two questions. So one, what motivated you to do this in the first place? And second, why civil-military relationships between India and Pakistan? Because, and third, what were you trying to update at this point in time? What is the angle that you were?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's lots of questions. I hope I remember them. But look, multiple things, Badri. Firstly, I think I had a bit of an empty feeling after law school because I didn't take law school seriously enough.
Right.
I just kept my head above the water. I got into practice the day I was out of law school. And after whatever 8-10 years of being at the bar, to be honest, I started to miss the academic side of things. Maybe I wanted to kind of compensate for that lack. Equally being at the bar, I knew that I didn't want to study the law. I've lost the ability now to read the law unless there's a case. I cannot read a judgment unless I'm linking it to a dispute.
Why is that? You say that
because, we've got
the law.
Sorry,
is that, I mean, like, does that have something to do for the joy that you get from reading the law which you've lost, or is it something like that, or is it just the set which you come across the law as a little different?
No, I mean, the joy of reading the law for me is its application to facts and then its performance, as you called it, or its advocacy in court. So I can extend that to if I have to do, say, a lecture or maybe write a piece. I'd rather speak on the law than write on it. But having said that, on the academic side, as you said, a PhD is a lot of hard work. It's a lot of backbreaking work in terms of research and writing. And to do that, remember, I had to first get a master's in place because I was only a BA LLB honors. So I think at one level, it was to compensate for that lack. The other thing, as I said, was I didn't want to do it with the law. Interestingly enough, the only master's I could do with the Bangalore University with distance education, because I was in practice, I wasn't going to go on a sabbatical to do my master's, right? The courts would forget me if I was away for 2 years. The only available master's, funnily enough, was an MA in political science.
Oh, interesting. So if it was in, say, MA in anthropology, would you have, would you have done that instead?
No, but I would have done it if it was in English, to be frank. That was my first choice.
Right.
I thought I'd do that and then possibly do a doctorate in something around, I don't know, maybe literature, poetry, whatever. And I had an old Hindi master from school who was pushing me in that direction. But ultimately, since the Polsky was the only option available, I went with it, did the master's. It was not really fun. It was interesting, but it wasn't great fun. And then came the question of the PhD. And I've had a sort of an abiding interest in military matters.
Right.
So I said, since it's my baby, I would rather choose to do my research in a subject that is close to my heart. It doesn't add to my CV. It doesn't add to my profession, as it were, right? So I thought the pull would be to do it with a topic that I have a sort of a curiosity about and an interest in. And that kind of, I've had an intrigue even with Pakistan as a country. We're a partition family. So I think those things came together and helped me zero in on this topic. Your last question, very quickly, you said, what was the update I was doing? Well, two things. One is there have been a series of developments on this front over the last 8 years. My doctorate was 8 years ago. So it needs a bit of updating on aspects. We've had now a chief of defense staff appointed. Pakistan has had civilian government for the last 2 terms, which is unprecedented. So there's stuff to talk about. On the other hand, I wanted to revise my writing style because that writing style was kind of not me anymore. I wanted to give it a little bit of my flavor as I am as a person now. And yeah, so those are the 2 things I've tried to do.
Okay. Now, I think you keep saying things which beget more, possibly more and more intimate questions. So if it's getting too much, you should tell me to stop. But what do you mean your writing style is not your writing style? You haven't been writing briefs for a while now, and you haven't had to do that for a while, right? So obviously that means that the form of your writing, which might have flourished in the interim, is your artistic writing, the work that you've been doing with prose and poetry. So do you mean to say that's what has been informing your writing? Do you feel like your writing has become more sensitive to the flourishes of language? I mean, when I say flourishes of language, I mean that the point that you're trying to convey is as important as the aesthetics and the form in which you're trying to convey it. Do you feel like that's evolved over some time?
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. There is a new aesthetic, if you will, to approaching, I would say, all things in life.
I agree.
Just the environment you live in is your personal aesthetic. It feeds your creativity, your office space, your briefs. Even the way, not just your brief reads, but the way a letter looks and feels, I believe is important. Space, a clean font, a good language, little things like that matter. And they're very personal. They're almost obsessive compulsive things, but they're important. And I did do 2 books of nonfiction, as you know, dedicated to my old school. And that's where I realized the stark difference in my, well, want of a better word, for my maturity in my writing. When I did the first book was very average. It wasn't subtle enough. It wasn't deep enough. And then as I went along and I did my second book, which I'm a little more proud of, because I think my research was much deeper. I owe that to my PhD, because then I think that is an important thing. A PhD, I don't care what subject you do it in. I see Professor Rashmi is here, and I'm sure she says this to her students. The PhD is just I think it's a technique of learning. And it makes you just go deeper and deeper and broader into subjects. And I think that made me realize that maybe I did my thesis and I wrote it because it had to be done. But reflecting on it and bringing in my sort of experience over 8 years meant that it had to be practically rewritten. Maybe not in content, but in aesthetic, as you said, in style, in flow, in ideation. You start becoming less extreme. When I was reading my paper, I was surprised. I had taken positions that I would not now. It's not that I've changed as a person, but a lot of those positions have gradations to them. And I suppose that's come over the years. And then you try and tone down your positions on things. You make them more, I won't say neutral, but you make them more real.
And more, I think it's more nuanced. It's more in contact with the world that you're in. I think, see, it's now 8:56. We can, as expected, close at 9, but that would be very unfortunate. I'm happy to speak with you for another 15 minutes, but what is your availability? Is that something
I'm fine with that. We'll be putting your viewers through the torture, but it's fine. I think most people have nothing else to do these days.
That's no, I think we shouldn't be laughing at it, Radhya. It's a somber moment.
Yeah.
This no. I mean, I kid, but this, as you were saying this, I was just thinking that while working with you, and I had the privilege of interning with you when I was much younger, right? I would say much more green and much more immature than I was right now, and I still have a long way to go in that sense. But as you were speaking of this, I just feel like you seem to be so much harder on yourself than you are compared to the people that you're with. Like than every time while working with you around the brief. And we worked together on a matter recently, and I felt like you were more exacting than you needed to be. I was like, what is up with this man? There's no reason for us to have, to require these kind of standards, And I can see that sort of applying to you in your work as well. So the question I want to ask you is, what are the ways in which you feel like you've changed over the last 10 or 20 years? Like, let's say 20 years. Let's not say 10 years. How do you feel? What are the ways in which you've changed from who you were right from when you got out of law school to who you are now? And what are the ways in which you stayed the same?
Yeah, I mean, again, a tough question to reflect on, but let me begin to answer it professionally. Firstly, I see that a couple of my juniors are here, present juniors, former juniors. They will tell you that I'm far harder on them than I am on myself. And my apologies to all of them for that. But look, out of law school, I don't think I was mentally tough enough for the real world of the law. The profession is very hard. Let me tell you, it's very hard, especially at the start. It's very hard because it's not just that the law is hard, but the circumstances are hard. If you're first generation, there are massive issues you have to deal with outside of just the complexity of a case. And I think these 20 years, in some ways, going through those processes day in and day out through the washing machine, I would like to think has made one slightly mentally more tough, not rigid, but perhaps more resistant and able to cope with those vicissitudes that come along on a regular basis. So I think that's certainly one thing. I mean, I was a sitting duck when I left the law school. I do not think the law school that both of us went to, and many law schools, really prepare us for the practice of the law. I say this with due respect. We're not given those soft skills and that morale that you need to enter the bar. And I think that's extremely important for young lawyers. So that's one. The other thing I think has been this kind of, you asked me why I was hard on myself or exacting. It's not. I mean, you'll ask my colleagues, our approach to every case is that I think you need to be over-prepared in a matter. There's no two ways about it. If it's at the cost of being practically paranoid about outcomes, so be it. Because and I've always said that advocacy is anticipation. You have to be able to anticipate multiple situations, right? So when you said a performance, this is a live performance. It's not that everyone has a script or everyone has a different script, right? So your judges and your opponents are going to throw things at you that you may have never prepared for. And it's those reactions that determine success or failure at the bar. And therefore, I think it's a huge mistake if lawyers think that the square of their brief is all there is. No, there are multiple facets to every case, be it the legal, be it the strategic, be it tactical, whatever it is. I don't want to go into detail, but it's only that kind of brings you close to being able to stay cool in court, because you've perhaps prepared for a question or a situation. It helps you react better. It helps you weigh your options. It doesn't mean that on every probability that the court places before you, you go back and consult with your advocates on record, who then consult with clients. I like to believe that a lot of that is already done in those rehearsals that you have in your conference rooms. And if that happens, I think you're better for it. Yeah, it does take a toll. It means you're taking more time on things. Sometimes you're putting your colleagues and your juniors in a spot because you're expecting more of them. But trust me, I would much rather go with that approach than go half cooked to court, be exposed. Those things affect you personally. They affect your reputation. And I'm very fearful of that. I'll be very honest. I would hate for someone to say that, you know, this guy takes a brief casually and yeah.
And, there's only, again, there are many things you've said which we can get into, but I'm going to focus on one thing, which is about the preparedness that we sort of have after law school, right? I've actually been feeling more and more recently that most of the practice of law is actually in the non-legal spaces, in the sense of what you pointed out. You said soft skills and so on and so forth. But I think there are two levels here, right? So one is in a certain way, let's say in our context, in your context, in my context, in the way it intersects with each other, the privilege of this relationship allows me to gain certain knowledge and insight about how to practice law, which most people don't have fundamentally. And the second thing is, in terms of you do say that what are the other non-legal things which you think we can teach more effectively through our education? I've been feeling more and more like the school of law should be around the practice of law, where the point of theory and the point of doctrine is to be able to contextualize how you practice it. It's not, I don't mean to say this in a way that is disrespectful of doctrine, because I really love theory. I really love theorization of things because there's a certain romanticism to it. And in a certain way, like the philosophy takes you further than your action can, right? It defines the ideals. Now the real exists in a world where we have to make the ideal possible as much as possible and keep iterating as much as we can. So how do you think in a legal program, we can balance the romanticism, the idealism, the aspiration that is associated with a deeply philosophical approach to law with the necessary soft skills so that you don't end up a softie at the end of it? And I the access point was a fundamentally different point, but like if you can address both, it would be interesting to hear about it.
What was the other point, Badri? I'm sorry, I lost that. The access to justice, did you say?
No, access to you. Like access to you means that I hear certain stories about what mistakes I shouldn't make. Now, most people will not have this relationship. And like you and I had the privilege of going to a law college, shared an alma mater that allowed me to reach out to you and have this thing. But like, I feel like the practice of law is really hampered by, say, the inability to convey what you've learned in terms of soft skills to really the much larger.
I followed. Yeah. So look, I mean, first and foremost, I think we need to break mind blocks. I've always said this. A lot of law schools have mind blocks built in with the practice. And that's for multiple reasons. I don't want to get into them, but there has to be a level of engagement right from the start with advocacy. And that has, sorry?
From the first year as a 17, 18-year-old.
Especially from the first year, because that's perhaps when you're least influenced.
Right.
I've said this, as you go along, and that first year to the second year and onwards is exponential. And I think pretty much by the end of your second year or your early third year, you've by and large only heard bad things about the practice and so on. And therefore, it's an easy and a lazy choice you've made. You said, who's going to do that? Let's just consider the multiple other options that exist in the profession. So I think there has to be tall leadership. This is not a blame game. It's about saying, look, there is a prejudice that's inbuilt for whatever reasons. Let's address it. That's number one. Number two is this, which is what you're doing. You're talking about humanizing the law, right? So you need to then be able to get counsel and judges and people who've been within the system to be able to talk about their experiences. There is, I'm sorry to say, very little writing, for example, on the careers of lawyers and judges, right? We don't have quality biographies.
I know what the title of your next book is going to be. It better be on the practice of law, And I mean that I'm thinking, what is that? The bureaucratic novel on an English August. What's his name? The name is not coming to me right now.
Not Upamanyu Chatterjee.
Upamanyu Chatterjee's book. I wonder what the legal equivalent of that would be. I don't mean that.
I don't know. I'm looking for it. What I mean to say is, see, the Karnataka bar has a rich history, but unfortunately, it's not been passed down the generations. And that's because a lot of seniors have been very self-effacing people. But having said that, I wish that there were biographers.
Right.
Not everyone's an autobiographer. The problem with autobiographies is they become hagiographical. A lot of reading you get, I'm afraid, is about self-glorification. That's fine. I mean, that maybe now Wikipedia will...
It's also the opposite, because if it's not self-glorification, it's self-loathing, which is made public. So I feel like the autobiography only seems to operate in the extremes. So you don't seem to, and I'd be very curious to see. I mean, I know Winston Churchill is not really the greatest figure to emulate outside of his, the way he thinks about personal writing. I find his writing to be extremely illuminating because it feels like it's a reflection on his inner life, right? And let's say you were writing about this, Aditya, I would really love to read. I mean, I don't want to call it a Dear Diary edition, but I want to understand how your encounters with the law create impressions on you. What are the ways in which it affects you? What are the ways in which it moves you fundamentally? And I don't mean that moving. I mean moving the way theater would move you. I don't mean moving in the sense that, oh, I've learned a new point of law today, right?
No, I know. You're talking about an emotional quotient.
Right.
And I do believe there is a time and a station in everyone's life when they have stories to tell and they're good stories. And one should, I think, do that in good time when you frankly have something to write home about. So one mustn't jump the gun there. But having said that, those interactions can be seamless. They can be like this. They can be structured around, law school lectures and so on, which are not just about substantive topics, but they are in fact about exactly this. That what has moved you, what are the cases that have driven you, that have challenged you, not just challenged you legally, challenged you personally, when people have risked their lives and people, I'm not talking about myself, I'm speaking about a lot of activist lawyers who literally put their lives on the line on a daily basis. They have stories to tell. Those are stories of moral courage. They're stories of leadership. Which have to permeate. If somebody comes away a slightly taller leader, what's the harm? You can be a leader in a law firm, you can be a leader in a university, right? So
you can be a leader anywhere, I think. There's a, remember Andy Grove wrote this book on management, right? And he would say, Andy Grove was the legendary CEO of Intel. And he was cool because he said that everyone needs to be a manager. I mean, I know manager as a term is derisive almost. But the notion of a manager as being someone who's a leader, someone who is understanding of what it means to participate responsibly within a structure, right? And I mean, of course, I have my own problems with the corporate structure because I feel like it prioritizes hierarchy before it prioritizes expression. So that's a whole different challenge. But here, really, the challenge is one of self-governance and self-determination. So that's a skill I feel like really we could have more and more younger lawyers cultivating. Sorry, go on.
I mean, just quickly say that every young lawyer, especially a young independent counsel setting up a practice, you said manager, I would say is an entrepreneur.
Absolutely.
So that spirit of enterprise, risk-taking, a first-generation lawyer's office is a startup. These startups have been in place for generations and generations, and there are practices and the policies and the principles to be learned from those experiences. They have very little to do with the law. They are a lot to do with man management, with relationships, with walking that line while adhering to your ethical requirements, at the same time growing in the profession. And I think very importantly for me, discovering who you're not. It's very easy to say, I'm this, I'm that, blah, blah. There are facets to our personality that we have to realize are not us. There are some things we don't do. And it's that realization only comes when you're on your own. You talked about solo travel. I mean, you're solo travelers in the profession, and it'll spook you. And that's when you will realize that you've got to do a real take on who you are, what you want, and try and survive through this. So yeah.
I mean, that's, I feel like we could speak for hours without interrupting, but we should move into the, I would say, slightly more operational part of our conversation before we close at least. So we have two broad areas that we said we would talk about, right? So I want to talk to you, Aditya, about, you've been doing a lot of work with your trust, with your old school. And I want to ask you how you feel about giving. I mean, because one part of the way you think about giving is clearly I mean, is clearly in the context of arts and culture, and also in the context of the way you think about teaching, right? It's for you, it's almost, I mean, I see you doing talks and sessions nearly every week that you're around in some forum or the other, which is purely educational. It's not like you're getting anything back. Maybe there are some downstream results from it. Maybe you'll get a good junior, maybe you'll get a client, depending on the forum. But really, it's not meant to be transactional. But I want to understand how you think about giving in a structured way. I'm sure you make a lot of money. You think about like where it needs to be directed. You think about how it needs to be organized. What is your own philosophy about it? How clearly you don't do what you do because you can be wealthy. It's not. I mean, when I say it's your life is rich in not because you have money, but it's rich because the kind of stimuli that you're surrounded by, right? Like the last time I came by for one of those play readings, it was fascinating. Like to see everything from like Miles Davis to Birdman to like, it's really beautiful paintings and books. I didn't have space to sit down, and I think about the diversity of relationships, and it's pretty fascinating to me because I think of myself as someone who has a wide range of friends, and that's the wealth that you've sort of accumulated over your life. But how do you think about giving in terms of a structured way? What is your philosophy around it? What do you think about that?
Look, I mean, there are again 2 or 3 elements to it. From a purely professional perspective, I think knowledge is gained by sharing. It's perhaps a cliche, but I have no doubt that the more I dwell on topics, so there is a selfish interest. I mean, if you talk about teaching or lecturing, it's not that you just show up and speak through your hat, right? You work and you analyze, and especially when you take on, I have a thing for current and complex topics. It's got me into trouble sometimes, but it's the sort of thing I like to do because it stretches your mind and you come away more enlightened. So of course you're sharing knowledge with others, you're doing it unconditionally, but you are gaining a great deal also in your assessment and understanding of people and of matters. So that's one. The other giving that one has is purely professional. I think just doing pro bono litigation is satisfying. I believe that lawyers, regardless of how much money you make, should make that time and effort to do those sets of pro bono matters that drive you, and they're good for your soul. It helps you again share a rapport with the bar. None of this is networking. I don't like that word. For me, it's fellowship. It's about building friendship. Yeah, fraternity. Absolutely.
Like said that equality and liberty make no sense without fraternity.
Absolutely, and that's what it is. Be it,
I mean, sort of life about communion, right? Like if you can't commune, then there's no point in talking about these constitutional virtues.
I agree.
So, sorry, go on.
No, just to close the loop on that, since you're talking about giving, and we're talking here in a more literal sense of giving, which is reaching out and helping people in difficulty. I think, look, I don't think people should boast about any charity that they do. We're privileged in our own ways, and if we reach out to people, we must reach out to people with humility. I hate it when people talk down or look down upon others who are less privileged. But I can only say this. I won't talk about any of the trusts or the charity work that you mentioned, but I can say this, that some of my most poignant moments have been when we've tried to seek out people who have been forgotten. And when I say that, it's not just the money. Of course, the money is important. A lot of people need financial aid for family, for schooling of children, medical help. And frankly, no amount of money many times is enough for the circumstances that people are in. But more than anything is that sense of gratitude that I felt when you've reached out to somebody who's worked for an institution 40 years ago. It's that sense of being remembered. Trust me, it means a lot to people. And secondly, when you're reaching out to, widows and families and children, it really does touch them. And when it touches them, it touches you. It touches you very deeply. It's a it's an unparalleled feeling. And if that can, feed the drive and can make people step out and give, there are limitations on how much you can give. One may make some money as a counsel, but you have your own crosses to bear. There is a reality to it. Money is an important part of the profession, because I'll tell you, as a practitioner, money comes late. So when it comes, you value it. It's not just there to be given away. And we can talk about that another time. But long story short, there is a spirit to giving unconditionally and giving humbly, and I hope that we can all do that.
Nice that, I mean, I think it's like everything that you say, you have to, I don't know how you manage to say everything you say with some dignity, you know. It's like there's a sense of seriousness and purpose and order in the way that it comes out. And can I ask you what kind of causes you care about? We'll talk about this particular cause, but why don't you say a few sentences about your work? Because I don't mean that from the sense of self-glorification, but there are some causes you care about more than you care about other causes, right? Like there are some matters. What kind of pro bono matters do you like go out of your way to contemplate a little more carefully? For instance, you spoke about widows and other things, but I'd really rather hear from you. Now, in the sense that I think that you speaking about it would illuminate it for other people to also participate in this exercise. You know, that's really where I'm coming from.
Yeah, see, I think people should be responsible in combining their pro bono work with their expertise.
Right.
Just saying that I care for under trials and I will therefore do criminal trials may be self-defeating unless you know how to conduct a criminal trial. So let me first park that and say that you must get into pro bono work knowing that you can deliver. Sometimes you see that legal aid briefs are not taken seriously because there's no money in it. But I feel that legal aid briefs and pro bono briefs need you to be even more diligent and responsible. And you can't sit pretty and say, I'm doing it for free, therefore I'll do it casually. No, that's self-defeating. So So there are multiple issues. I think at the end of the day, you know when there's a need for justice and you can feel that and you can step up to it and do it. That's one of the advantages of being a senior counsel. If a brief comes your way, somebody wants it to be done pro bono and you feel you can deliver, do it. But yeah, I mean, see, so like, for example, labor issues. There are some cases one is done where, employees were not being regularized. They were being discriminated on being paid. They were working for state organizations. There's a need there. There's a need when it comes to, unlawful detentions, for example, sometimes. There are needs to do with, fundamental rights of persons when they're being infringed and so on. And and there are some which may not be people specific. For example, zoning and urban planning and so on. Some amount of the pro bono litigation that I've done related around, zoning regulations for Bangalore, commercialization of residential areas, master plans, and so on. And those are also public interest, but those again directly affect us. Ecological issues, being amicus, I don't want to ramble, but being amicus on some of these matters. One dealt with, the thermal power plants in the state where there are serious health hazards and safety hazards for workmen, bore well deaths. So, it's a broad spread, but each of these has a legal challenge to it also. And it's good. If you think you can do it, one should do it without nitpicking.
I think there's actually two very critical, I think, I was about to say subficial as the opposite of superficial. I don't know what's happening to my vocabulary in this conversation. But essentially, there are 2 points that you very subtly made right now, which is one, that everyone can have a conception of justice, which is relevant to them. It doesn't all have to be the same. And the second subtle point that you made was that every context can have a manifestation of justice. Whether you're talking about ecological manifestation or you're talking about like master planning or you're talking about labor. I like the fact that you make it cause agnostic, which which really makes it possible for you to empathize with that aspiration of justice that makes sense to you.
Yeah.
I think that's a good characterization. The fact that we think about how we want to participate in the world should be organized around our competence as well as our interest. So that's a nice way of framing it. But do you think that's inaccurate? Do you want to add any more to that framing?
No, I think that's fair. It's really about a consciousness and a willingness that you develop. And once you do that, you need to then stay open to those options when they come your way. And each council will have his or her case or cause that's close to them, and you just need to work and develop that as it goes along.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, I think now we're at 9:20. We know that we can go for another couple of hours if we have to, but we won't. begin to start closing, right? So let's talk about the reason why we're doing this. Now, there's one fundamental philosophy that drove this entire exercise idea, which is that, in the spirit, I mean, what we notice happening right now is essentially private companies behaving more and more publicly, right? And as citizens also, we are also, the public nature of our existence is becoming more and more visible. Like, it's a responsibility to stay at home. It's a responsibility to have protective gear. It's a responsibility to make sure that the people who work with us and who live with us and make our existence possible are taken care of as well as possible, whether it's migrant workers, whether it's like the urban poor, whether it's as a caregivers. And really, like, now I think our notion of caregivers also has to expand. It needs to include your kirana wala. It needs to include the barber. It needs to include It's fundamental, right? Like, there's no reason why we should think about protective gear only in the context of, say, hospital workers, right? And so the reason why we started doing this is essentially that now the public nature of our existence is becoming obvious. You see private companies, I mean, Zoom, for instance, has been giving so many organizations like free meeting licenses. So public institutions, I mean, you see individual companies, I don't have to name names, but Infosys and Wipro have done, I said I won't have to name names and did exactly that, but they've done such a fabulous job of opening up their kitchens. There's so much like large happiness coming out of it. I read an article by Azim Premji yesterday or day before, who I think is easily one of the most generous human beings to have graced this generation.
I think so too. Yeah.
Well, I mean, such amazing large-heartedness with such great simplicity and grace. And no fuss made about it. He makes it seem as though it's the most normal thing. And I really like that it's such a normal way of being. So I want to hear how you reflect on our duty towards each other, because now contributing to this cause is really contributing to ourselves, And the way I've been thinking about it personally is that any cause that comes by, we should find some way of supporting it. And you support it with your vibes. In fact, I would say, Aditya, even for you, your vibes are more important than your money. The fact that you and I can have an open-hearted conversation at this point in time is far more important than any money that you can donate towards this.
Sure.
Right? I mean, it's a different matter that you've been so generous about how you want to do it and why you want to do it. And I really admire that. And so thank you for that.
Sure. Thank you.
This at the same time, like, even being able to open your wallet, pass on $10 or $100 or $1,000 or $10,000, it really doesn't make a difference. What's far important is the sort of virtue and the virtue that you're trying to cultivate, the energy that you're trying to spread in the world. So can you just reflect on that a little bit? It's a bit of, it's not really as much. What's your feeling about this?
Look, charity begins at home. I think first and foremost, people have to look out at their immediate structures and continue to honor their obligations. If employers are not paying employees, or you're not paying your landlord or landlady, you're not paying your driver or your house help, then you've already lost the plot, according to me. So first and foremost, one needs to honor that to the extent you can. I mean, I realize businesses are now going bankrupt. So it's a bit rich sometimes to say that you've got to be charitable to everyone. You have to think of yourself as well. It is a problem. It's 2-3 months of no revenue for most professions. And it is a huge problem, but fair enough. I mean, you can't be petty about it. You have to think about those things. That's number one. Number two, with the sort of things you're doing, I think one has to put his money where his mouth is. So you have to separately share with me your, I think you already have, so I can chip in and begin in some way to support this cause that you guys have set up, so that others can chip in.
You guys, because I mean, I've rescheduled this exercise with you exactly 3 times. It would have been a 4th time today, given how it was going. And we started. The point I'm trying to make is that there is no you and I here.
I appreciate that.
There is an I and a we and a we and an I. And that's really like what we're trying to promote and sort of amplify, right? And more than chipping in, you're not chipping in for me. You're chipping in to feed your soul. You're chipping in for each other, right? Like, and I don't mean to say that as an affront as much as to point out that this is really a matter of collective existence. It's not so much about.
No, of course it is. I mean, I think our sense of empathy has got to be sharper now. We have to, as much as we're distancing ourselves physically, but I do believe spiritually, or whatever the word might be, metaphysically, we have to come together as a community, right? This is a global problem. Whether it's man-made or not is besides the point. The fact is we're all in it. And there is a certain moral support you derive from one another. It's important. There are mental health issues. These are very real problems. I don't think those issues are dependent on one's standing in society or one's money. Now, I've realized over the last 2-3 months that I'm professionally nowhere near as relevant as others who are on the front line, right? It's very humbling. What I mean is that who's fighting this battle? Are lawyers integral to the COVID fight? Not yet. We're not essential services.
But I don't think that's fair at all, Aditya.
Let me complete. We're not essential services. For the longest time, we were not even able to step out. Even now, the courts are closed. There are, of course, virtual hearings going on. I recently did a talk about how COVID can't make us go completely virtual. There's a different problem there. That's besides the point. Of course, there are important PILs happening as we speak where lawyers have a say. But in your everyday battle, where people's health and safety and life is at stake, we're not doing it. Let's make no mistakes. And I feel very humbled by that. Who's doing it? It's your officers on the ground, cops, bureaucrats, whoever it may be, corporation officials, health workers, doctors, ambulance drivers, your Swiggy delivery guys who are out there. They are in the thick of it and they face the same threats that we do. They're less insulated. They're far greater at risk. Whatever the drive may be, you must have seen that young doctor who came home to an apartment in Bangalore and got an ovation from every apartment. How brilliant was that? Have you and I ever done anything of that sort? No, maybe a cricketer someday would have got it, but this is real, right? And why are people doing that? As much as they're abusing and even attacking doctors and so on, I don't know why we're becoming savage, but there is a realization that some people today are far more valuable to society than the others. And I think we must smell the coffee and respect that.
I think so. I'm so sorry that I interrupted you earlier because, I mean, I guess that this is the tenor of your argument because I just wanted to, I mean, when you were saying that, I was just thinking that it's almost like we have an obligation to figure out how to be relevant to the moment, right? In a sense that each one of us must think about how we can increase the amount of justice around us. Now, can we be, like, for instance, I've been thinking a lot about tipping. I don't have many variable expenses that I would have had otherwise. So, and this I'm seeing amongst a lot of my friends, automatically, they seem to be more giving, more easily, the other day I went and bought tomatoes and it was 10 rupees a kg and destroyed my heart. I was like, I mean, if we are buying it for 10 rupees, imagine what's happening upstream. And so really the question for us is, what kind of responsibility can we have to be as generous to the unity of our existence, as generous to our communion. And that's where I was coming from. But I think you put it really well, because the fact of it being humbling is not the end. It's a point of departure. So what do you do about that humbling? I mean, in your case, you're doing many things, including sessions such as these, you're imparting knowledge, you're developing spiritually and artistically and all of that. So I think it's really nice. So
and I may just say one thing here is that we have to keep our pulse on things, that this has become such a game changer. And I've said this before, it can't change our DNA as people. Many times disease and pandemic helps species, well, if they're not destroyed, they evolve, right? But evolution at its heart is becoming better. And I've been very seriously concerned, and I've been thinking about it, that are we going to become completely automated as people? Which is why, yes, you said doing talks. I'm glad that I was able to do a talk commissioned by the Advocate Sunday Club about what little I know, which is courts and they're being virtual, because I am seriously concerned about it, that while accepting a new normal and a change in lifestyle and so on, we cannot become bots. We can't lose our grain. We can't live lives with just our laptops. Hopefully someday in the near future, these conversations will happen live. Is that not so much better, right? To have that touch and feel of an event, of a practice. And I think there we have an important responsibility, all of us. We can't just reconcile to this and say, COVID came and hit us and now there is no going back. Of course there is. I mean, we have to be able to resist this as best we can. Whatever is evolutionary and important and relevant to change, where technology can enable it, it's absolutely welcome. There's no two ways about it. I'm not being old school in that sense. But beyond that, humanity is being seriously challenged by this. We don't socialize, we don't interact, you can't shake hands with people. I don't want to replicate what I've said before. You can't even condole somebody who's had a bereavement. Families are not by their own parents when they're dying. I mean, what is this? This is dark and miserable in that sense, right? And these are the parts we have to now undo and reclaim. And there, I think lawyers or whatever we are, we have to keep that consciousness about us, that we don't just slip into being a new species whenever we return to normalcy. And that's important to me.
I've been thinking a lot about normalization, Aditya, because this, the way I think about it is that machines and animals can evolve, feel, think, grow, do, but humans are the only ones who can do all of these things. Machines can do some of these things, animals can do some of these things, but the fact of our agency, the fact of Socrates and Aristotle used to talk about communication, right? Like our language makes it possible for us to be human. And I like to think about the normalcy right now to say that to think about how we can transmit communion over technology. Because this is not a problem we have had to solve before. But what does it mean to say be intimate and intimately connected to another individual through Zoom is a question that we have the, I would say, privilege of answering almost, because like crisis is really crappy. Crisis is grim as hell, but it makes agency visible and it makes, grace possible. And that really is what we need to strive for. So I don't want to say going back, because it's really a matter of how we evolve and how we use this opportunity of having found communion at a distance. Like there's no way we could have had an event from 8 to 9:30 at some place right now, have the number of people that we have tuning in either into the call or the number of people who are tuning into our channels, right? So I want to think about evolution as evolution, not so much as going back as much as going forward, So it's just to like put a little spin on that. But why don't we start? I mean, we've started wrapping up many times now.
Yeah. It's 9:30. I think
it's time.
Well and truly fed up by now.
No, I like it's okay, Aditya. If you're not fed up, I'm not fed up. Then I suppose we are
free to. I'm just hungry, so I need to be fed up.
Oh my God! See, like now people are going to realize that you make jokes which are. No, your words, not mine. Okay.
So maybe we'll do maybe one or two questions and then call it a night.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. So, okay, so this, we are kicking off this exercise, and you're going to be back here talking about the Bangalore bar very soon, and not just alone. There are other very interesting panelists with you. We're very lucky to have some very good speakers coming in. Do you want to say a few words about how you find this exercise exciting? And we'll use it for our publicity materials and all these other.
I think I did cover a lot of that in response to your first question itself, but purely from the perspective of the law also, I see that you've lined up good and more importantly, many of them are interesting people. So when you're talking about, law, love and equity as you've branded it, you're clearly going beyond just the professional discourse. So yeah, it's and that there are people who are comfortable talking about things that transcend, and some are not, and there's no right or wrong about it. But it's good that if you're able to get people's personal ideological positions on things, it's very important.
A spiritual position as well. Like so much of what you said has not been ideological, right? It's been personal, moral, spiritual.
Sure. But even the ideological leanings that people have are important, because it conveys, again, this mind block that I talked about. People think lawyers and a conscience don't go together. That's not true. I had a quick look at your list. My friend and classmate Arvind is on your panel, and I'm sure he'll bring to the table a very fine and refined spirit of the law. And that's important in my opinion, because it bridges that gap. It makes not just the law more humane and accessible, but it also makes people who are on the fence a little more comfortable. As youngsters, we all have moral dilemmas, right? And the moment something seems slightly taboo, you're going to tend to lean away from it. And I think a lot of this is going to reinvent the position for those fence sitters and tell them, look, here are examples, and I see them in your panel of people who can speak from the heart. So yeah, that's an important facet of what you're doing. I hope you're able to deliver. It's the devil is in the details. So
no idea, but this is not me. So if anyone says, I disclaim all responsibility over it. It's, if you're not speaking from the heart, it's your fault. It's not just my fault. But I know you said 1 or 2 questions, but I think this is a great place to like close for us. And I just have to say thank you so much for the privilege of being able to speak the truth, and I feel great to be able to listen to you in a context which I've never had the luxury of having this conversation with you, not at this length, right? We've always had like snatches of 5 minutes here and there. And this is the kind of thing nobody has time for. If this hadn't happened, we would have never been able to reflect on it at this level of detail, So I'm so grateful that we were able to have this conversation. I hope you didn't have a terrible time. And I look forward to more poor jokes from you and a lot more from the heart. And
thank you. Thanks for having me, Badri. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. And if you have a parting message, I mean, you've had enough parting messages. I think we can say bye, good night, good luck.
Yep. You've said it all. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Aditya. See you.
Bye.
Bye.